Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name might be Isaiah and today I want to talk about Baedelism. What is Baedelism and why did it cross my radar? Well, to go through this whole thing, I actually want to try and present what Baeddel is through as neutral a light as possible before I start critiquing it, and you will see why. But I will say this has to do with some of the intra-trans uh, drama that I've been discussing lately and I've been so thoroughly disenchanted with. So, let's start with the term Baeddel. Now, what is it? Where is it from? The people who self identify with this word say that it is from the Old English and it has come to today meaning bad. That's the etymology of bad. And back in the day, back in the Old English times, it used to be used as a slur against effeminate men as well as intersex people. Now, with the effeminate men, that means both gender nonconforming men as well as trans women. So, who are the people that saw this slur and decided they wanted to call themselves that? Well, back in the early 2010s, it was a group of trans women who were more on the rad femme lesbian separatist movement, meaning they were women loving women and they did not want anything to do with men. In many cases, they didn't want anything to do with people who have done anything with men. So that's sort of people. They created a sort of the typical inner clique that you would find on Tumblr with a larger spectrum around them. And this inner clique eventually dissolved after some intercommunity drama where essentially one of the head honchos apparently sexually assaulted another high ranking member, and everyone defended the assaulter, and they sort of dissolved. There's been a couple attempts for them to come back, with the latest one I've noticed being in late November of this year, 2021, and it's mostly on Twitter. So, as someone who's no longer on Tumblr and has never used Twitter, this was off my radar until I saw something on, of course, Reddit, where I was like, what does that mean? And there wasn't any really good explanation underneath where I had found it. So I decided to do some hunting myself and I came across all of this information. So that is the most neutral, nuanced look that I can give about Baeddel and the history behind it and where we're at now. Now, I'm going to give my opinions on it. Baeddel is a term that was used in the early 2010s as a way to separate trans women who were lesbian separatists from both cis women, as well as to give themselves an excuse to actively hate on men, including trans men. Now, they have some funny terminology, funny meaning odd in this case, because it's so unfamiliar to me. It was from a completely different time of trans discussion, and it seems to crib a lot of terminology from intersex people, which kind of makes sense because they have already taken battle or Baedelism or whatever from the intersex community. So they would use terms like CASAB, and that is coercively assigned sex at birth. Instead of the usual AFAB AMAB, they would use CAFAB CAMAB. They also would use terms like TME and TMA. That is transmisogyny excluded and transmisogyny affected. And they would interpret this to be the excluded is typically cis people and AFAB people. So it could be trans men, it can be gender nonconforming AFABs. Whereas the TMA was almost always exclusively trans women. So also gender nonconforming AMAB people would not be included. I also noticed a lot of the same central anger towards men, which shouldn't surprise anyone from hearing the rad femme lesbian separatist ideas. But I've mentioned before in the past that I would constantly read about man hating from cis people. And this is essentially the same thing, but they include trans men in their man hating. Whereas the cis circles that I usually saw wouldn't include anything about trans people at all. Like I said, it was like proto TERFism. So it doesn't surprise me that when all of this is coming up again, a lot of trans masked people are seeing people identifying as Baeddel, and they're like, okay, so you hate trans men, because that is explicitly what was happening back then. Also, Baeddels back then were essentially a cult. And this isn't me saying it. This is someone, I believe her name is Leslie Harpy, who used to be in the inner circle of the Baeddels on Tumblr, saying that they were gaslit. The moment that you disagreed with the majority, you were taken out of the group and basically made a heretic. And the alleged sexual assault, yep, that happened. And both the victim and the rapist reached out to the group, and they sided with the rapist. So even when I was trying to be as nuanced as possible, I couldn't leave that out, because that ended up being the inciting incident to their dissolution. But why is it coming up today? It has to do with a movement on Twitter. I don't know what's going on there. I don't follow Twitter. When I went through the Baeddel tag, I was just flabbergasted by what I was seeing. There were people giving receipts on why Baeddel is not a term that should be reclaimed, at least not currently. Because, I mean, come on, it's heavily associated with this one movement. There were other people talking about how people who are not trans women shouldn't be talking about what can and can't be reclaimed. There is a lot of ignoring of the intersex aspect of things. And just all of this. So it's a lot of back and forth. It's a lot of turmoil. And I think this is what has moved over to Reddit a bit, when I have been called a TERF for wanting to talk about trans mask issues and talk about the fact that we're spoken over so much by the greater trans community. And I'm realizing I've also seen people say that Baeddel is being used as a slur against trans women, even though these are people who are selecting to, or electing mostly to, use the term Baeddel, kind of like what TERFs are doing. There's also a lot of trans women are the most oppressed. No one can be more oppressed than a trans woman sort of deal going on, which I have decided is not true, for myself at least, because I believe that the idea of claiming one group of people is the most oppressed just starts the oppression Olympics again that the right loves to talk about. It's not conducive to solutions, and trans men and trans women get hurt by trans misogyny and trans androphobia in very different select ways, but it's all at the end of the day transphobia. And the fact that trans men and trans masked people want to talk about their issues without qualifying trans women into the discussion in any way is not a sign of trans misogyny, because we're not asking trans women to come in and start qualifying their arguments about why trans men are still valid. Like, the assumption should be we can have these discussions. Like, in the greater feminist circles, when we're talking about women's issues, we tell men to shut up about their stuff. So we expect to have these conversations about men's stuff somewhere, right? Well, I mean, we don't. Not really. But we're telling people to shut up and not talk over each other. But the moment the quote unquote privileged people start trying to talk about their issues in our own space or on our own thread or our own posts, we get told to shut up. You can tell that kind of bothers me. But really, what's really funny is the entire foundation of what Baeddel means and where it comes from is just built on shaky ground. And this comes from someone on Tumblr called Trans Gentleman Luke. I will try my best to link to the specific post that he made so that you can check my sources. And I'm going to read a little bit from it as well as put it into my own words. But Trans Gentleman Luke is someone from the UK who used to study linguistics in university. And it kind of goes over the fact that Old English is like super, super old, like 600s super old, and it doesn't look anything like English. And it's important to remember they are claiming that Baeddel is from Old English. They also say that it refers to trans feminine people, implied usually that it is more so than used against intersex people, and that it goes back to Old English. So remember those assertion. Remember those claims. I can't fucking speak. So, up until the 1700s, Trans Gentleman Luke says, is the opposite of good wasn't bad, it was evil. And in fact, Baeddel is used in a lot of English place names like Baddely Green and Baddely Edge, that sort of thing. And bad itself usually came from into vogue as the opposite of good around like the 1700s. And they actually point out 1777 when Johnson's dictionary was first published. So essentially, Baeddel couldn't have originated in Old English to mean bad, because Old English at the time when it was being used, the opposite of good was evil. And Baeddel has become the sort of originating word for several places that are named using Baeddel as the basis. I hope that makes sense. Basically, like Baddely, that sort of thing, they come from the word Baeddel. Bad did develop in Middle English as bad with 2 D's and an E, but it didn't really get widespread use until after the Johnson's dictionary. No one really knows where bad, 2 D's and an E, came from, but they suggest that it's the origin from the same word as bed, with connotations of laziness, which is why bad means negative things. Relevant is how bed, B-E-D-D, is potentially the origin of battling, which is derogatory towards intersex people, as in one who lies too much in bed is too delicate. So, battling is relevant because it was a term to refer to intersex people and was relevant in the order of succession of firstborn sons. And that's important because, medieval law, firstborn sons, genitals can be ambiguous, all of that stuff. So anyway, that is the truth behind battle, is it's not actually where everyone's saying it's from. It wasn't used as a insult towards trans femme people or femme men. And the Baeddels are actually completely erasing the fact that this term was used towards intersex people, and bad itself wasn't even used until the Middle English, I believe. Middle English, New English, something like that. It wasn't used until the 1700s. So, if the foundation of this word is rotten, and there's been such a recent scandal surrounding it, where this core group of people that identified with it disintegrated because they were harboring a rapist, and all of this has so much hatred towards men. I don't know why people are wanting to reclaim it. It doesn't seem like a very good term to use. Now, I am going to say, if anyone is calling a woman who wants to talk about trans misogyny a Baeddel, they need to not do that. We don't need to turn it into the same weapon that TERFs try to use the word TERF for. We should only take notice if someone is using Baeddel to refer to themselves and try to avoid them. I am going to leave it up to the trans femme community to police themselves, but I'm also, if I ever notice this term or the ideology behind it being used against the trans masc community, I'm going to do what is in my power to defend my trans masc peers, because at the end of the day, Baeddel is essentially TERFism, but for trans women. And that is horrifying to see the man-hating go so far that trans women are also perpetuating this. And with that very confusing, slightly jumbled thing, I'm going to call it. I've got laundry yelling at me, so I gotta switch that over. And I will talk to y'all tomorrow. Stay hydrated and don't be a Baeddel. Bye.